Hello everyone and welcome to today's EAUC webinar. The title of this webinar is Adaptation Part 2, Section 4 of the Public Body's Climate Change Reports, and it will last approximately 1 hour. Thank you for registering, and thanks also to Sophie Turner from Adaptation Scotland and Roddy Yar from the University of Strathclyde, who will be speaking today. My name is Rebecca Petford and I am the Scotland Programme Coordinator here at the EAUC. If you have any specific event, webinar or training requests, please do get in touch with me at any time. Just a little bit of housekeeping to go over. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me well. I've muted you all to avoid background noise, and you'll continue to be muted throughout the webinar. If you're having any technical issues at all throughout this webinar, please let me know by either posting in the on-screen chat box, which is bottom right on your screen, or sending me an email to rpetford@eauc.org.uk. We will take questions using the chat box. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the chat box and send them to EAUC using the drop-down menu. I will read them out to Sophie and Roddy at the appropriate time, so please be as clear as you can in your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded as a resource with the presentation later on today. Please feel free to share these resources with any colleagues or fellow EAUC members. Once the webinar is finished, you'll be sent a short survey for us to gain your feedback. Please take a few minutes to complete this survey, as the results will help us to improve our CPD and events. That's all for me for now. Thanks again for registering, and I will now pass you over to Sophie Turner.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sophie Turner. I'm the Climate Resilience Project Coordinator at Adaptation Scotland, and welcome to part 2 of our adaptation webinars. The EAUC has invited us to provide this webinar for those of you who are unable to make our ADAPT training event in Edinburgh in May. So for any of you that did attend that training, this will be more of a refresher for you. That was a full-day event, so we have split the webinars into 2 sessions. Our last one provided an introduction to adaptation, the adaptation process, and how to get started. And that's now available from the EAUC website, as Rebecca's just said. And today's webinar will cover the adaptation section of the Public Body's Climate Change Reporting. So for today's presentation, I'll start by explaining who Adaptation Scotland are and what we do. I'll briefly cover the key points from last week's webinar on the climate change policy and legislation, what adaptation is and how this differs from mitigation, and a quick introduction to the adaptation process. I'll then work through the questions in the Public Body's Climate Change Reporting, show you how these align with our 5 steps guidance, and give you some examples from last year's report. And then I'll hand over to Roddy Yar from Strathclyde University, who will explain his work on adaptation and how he has made progress. And there's opportunity for questions at the end of my presentation and at the end of Roddy's presentation. So a little bit about who we are. Adaptation Scotland is a programme funded by the Scottish Government and delivered by an environmental charity called SNIFR. We provide guidance and support on adaptation to increase the resilience of organisations and businesses and communities to the impacts of climate change. This support takes many forms. We develop tools and resources such as our 5 steps guidance. We help raise awareness about adaptation through presentations and providing information on our website. We encourage and support organisations to work together on adaptation projects. And we deliver training events and courses on adaptation for different groups and sectors, such as this event today. So that's us. Now a bit of background to the policy and legislation which forms the basis for the Public Body's Climate Change Reporting. Firstly, there's the Climate Change Scotland Act from 2009, which requires a Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme, or the SCAP. So this addresses the risks identified in the UK's Climate Change Risk Assessment, the CCRA. So the Act also established the Public Body's Climate Change Duties, which requires public bodies to help deliver the SCAP. And part of this delivery involves reporting on adaptation work through the Public Body's Climate Change Reporting. And this was introduced on a voluntary basis in November 2015 and became mandatory to report on an annual basis this year. So the deadline for this year's report is the 30th of November, And all of these reports are available in the public domain, and with last year's reports are available from the SSN website. So to be able to report on adaptation, it's useful to know what it is. The Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme defines adaptation as the adjustment in economic, social or natural systems in response to actual or expected climatic change to limit harmful consequences and exploit beneficial opportunities. So it's about making adjustments to prepare for the impacts of climate change, and this could include making changes to your buildings so they keep cool on hotter days, or making changes so they're less at risk of being flooded, a bit like yesterday and today. So adapting involves planning and preparing for the changes in the climate now so that you can build your resilience to the potential negative consequences. And so you're better placed to take advantage of any opportunities that a changing climate could bring. What's important to remember for both working through an adaptation process and for your public bodies reporting questions is that there are two elements to adaptation. There's adapting to the impacts you're experiencing today, and there's adapting to the impacts that are projected for the future. One of the biggest mistakes that people made in last year's public bodies reports was to reference their energy projects or their carbon management plans, but these are both to do with mitigation. It's easy to get confused on this point, but if you only take away one thing from this webinar today, let it be the difference between mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and so this involves using your car less, buying local food, refurbishing your boilers to make them more efficient, reducing your energy consumption. Adaptation is about adjusting to the impacts of climate change to reduce the negative impacts and exploit any opportunities. So this might include having an on-site power generator in case of disruption to the network, tiling, flooring or removing carpets from accommodation that are at risk of flooding, relocating vulnerable buildings, whether because of their usage or because they are at risk of coastal erosion, or building seawalls to protect infrastructure. Sometimes there are conflicts between the two. So, for example, if you decide to install air conditioning as part of an adaptation measure to reduce the impacts of heat stress, this will increase the amount of energy you're using to contribute to emissions. So it can be challenging. Other ways to reduce the heat in buildings is to have all the blinds down at certain times of the day and windows open. But to be really effective, you need to consider adaptation when you're thinking about like the orientation of the building or the fabric of the building. So how do you adapt? Managing your risks to climate change is part of an adaptation process, so which you can see here. The process usually consists of 5 steps like this one, which has been developed to break down the process into more manageable tasks. But the process is taken from our guidance document, which is called 5 Steps to Managing Your Climate Risks, and you can download this from our website. This document might also be useful for you to refer to when you're completing your public bodies climate change reports, and I'll be referencing this as I go through the presentation. I'm just going to run through this process. So step 1 is about the governance of adaptation, identifying who is going to work on adaptation and getting buy-in from your senior management to work on adaptation. Step 2 involves identifying what climate impacts you're vulnerable to. Step 3 involves looking at the risks you're vulnerable to and identifying and prioritising the most significant climate risks to adapt to. Step 4 is about implementing your adaptation actions and developing an adaptation action plan. And step 5 involves monitoring the climate risks you are vulnerable to, reviewing your policy documents to see if adaptation can be included, and evaluating your adaptation work. So if you take the 5-step process, you will see that the questions align quite well. Questions 2A, 2B and 2C, which are about governance, management and strategy, fall within step 1. Question 4AI is about current climate-related risks and falls within step 2. Question 4AII is about assessing future climate-related risks, which falls under step 3, and producing a climate change risk assessment. 4B is about the plans, policies and strategies in place, and 4C is about the actions taken to adapt to climate change, and these both fall within step 4. Anyone notice 4D was missing? 4D is about the SCAP, the Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. That's the only question that doesn't align with these steps. And 4E and 4F are about reviewing, monitoring and evaluating, which aligns with step 5. So the last point before we get onto the questions, this guidance note has been prepared by the SSN team at KSB to help you to complete your reports. The link to this is at the bottom of this slide, but you can find it on the KSB website under the resources section. The guidance is broken down into 7 parts that cover the 7 sections of the report, and part 4 is about adaptation. So it explains what each question is looking for and how you can complete each question. There's also guidance on the online reporting form. So onto the reports. Although section 4 is labelled adaptation, you also need to consider adaptation in section 2 of the reports. The first climate change question sits within section 2, which is about governance, management and strategy. The questions in this section are all looking for whether there are mechanisms in place that show that your organisation has made a start with climate change, which is discussed in step 1 of the 5 steps. So the first question asks, how is climate change governed in the body? This is looking for information on who takes responsibility for climate change issues in the organisation. Is it managed at the board level or at council level? Who are the climate change practitioners, if there are any? Is it just one person responsible, or there are a few people across different departments? And what are the links between the board, the managers, and the practitioners? So a summary of the hierarchy of the roles relating to climate change in the organisation would be useful to show these links, and this can be a written summary, a diagram, or a nice picture showing an organogram of everyone's faces and where climate change sits within this. The second question asks, how is climate change action managed and embedded in the organisation? So the key difference between this question and the last is the word action. It's not just about who has responsibility for climate change, it's about taking action. And the question also has 2 parts. It's managing the climate change action and embedding the climate change action. So you need to detail how the organisation manages, monitors and reports for the first part of the question. And for the second part, you can provide a brief summary of how climate change is embedded across all of the departments. So an example of embedding climate change might be that climate change is included on the risk register, or that staff have mitigation and adaptation objectives to meet in their performance criteria. Question 2C asks, does the organisation have specific climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives in its corporate plan or similar document? So this question is looking for evidence that your organisation has embedded mitigation and adaptation in the corporate plan, so you need to show specific objectives that refer to both mitigation and adaptation here, if they exist. If your corporate plan doesn't have specific mitigation and adaptation objectives, then you can just write exactly that. So answer yes or no first, and then either provide examples, or if it's a no, show you've understood the question. So just to recap, questions 2A, 2B and 2C are covered within step 1 of our 5-step guidance, which I'll explain next. So step 1 is about getting started and establishing the governance for your adaptation arrangements, which sits nicely along these questions. And this step includes identifying your aims and objectives for your adaptation work, working out who will be responsible for any adaptation work, seeing if there is anyone either within your university or college or externally, such as at your local council, who is available to help you or is able to share data or reports with you. And the final point is about embedding climate change on an adaptation risk on your risk register. So section 4 of the report is all about adaptation, and this is where the bulk of the questions will align with the 5 steps guidance. So the first question asks, has the organisation assessed current and future climate-related risks? With this question, it's best to consider it in 2 parts. So if you just look at the current climate, this is asking whether you have looked into or assessed the weather and climate impacts that you have recently experienced. And if you haven't done this, write no and maybe explain if or when you plan to do this. If you have assessed your current climate risk, you should be able to provide a link to your assessment and state what the climate variables are that your university or college are vulnerable to. But Please don't worry if you haven't done this. It's only if you still haven't done this after a few years of reporting that you might get asked why you haven't done this. One of the mistakes that people made on reporting on this question last year was to state that they had a risk register or say that climate change was included on the risk register, but that's not what the question's asking here. The question's looking for evidence of a full assessment of your current climate risks. So if you want examples of how you do this, page 17 and page 18 of our 5 steps guidance provides tables of weather and climate impact assessments. And this is similar to what the template on page 17 looks like. The idea is that you look at one critical function, service or asset at a time, and you work out whether it has been affected by weather events in the past, and then you look at the future climate trends, and these are just statements such as milder, wetter winters, warmer, drier summers, and then you assess whether your current risk will increase with a changing climate. And this is one way to assess your current climate risk. The other way is by completing a local climate impact profile, or an LCLIP. This isn't one of Adaptation Scotland's tools, it's from an organisation known as EAUC-Scotland, and I've got the link at the bottom of the slide there. About 1/3 of local authorities in Scotland have used this tool to assess their current climate-related risks. It's mainly a data gathering exercise, with the main component being a spreadsheet to complete with the information that you've collected. So what you end up with is something similar to this table, which is on page 18 of our 5 steps guidance. This is just to give you an idea of what is involved in assessing your current climate-related risks. So once you've collected your data, you can work through the columns from left to right, filling in what the weather event was, where it happened, the date it occurred, if there are any costs or reputational impacts, who the responsible department is, and whether any actions or policies have been put in place since that event. So the end result is a table which shows you have assessed your vulnerability to current climate-related risk, which is what question 4AI is asking for. This is an example from last year's reports. It says the organisation has carried out an LCLIP, or local climate impact profile, twice to assess its current climate vulnerability, once in 2009 and again in 2014, and the link to the second assessment is below. It's a short answer, but it does demonstrate that the organisation has understood the question and they've completed an assessment. Most importantly, they've provided a link to the assessment as evidence of their work, and the only thing that could be done to improve this question is to pull out some of the headline messages from their assessment. This is an example from a university. It says, in line with our university strategy, work has begun on evaluating the impact of climate change on the organisation. Planning work has started for a university-wide local climate impact profile and to run climate threat and opportunity process workshops with key colleagues. So this shows that they understand what's involved in assessing current climate-related risks, but they're yet to complete an assessment. And they've also detailed the timescales that they hope to complete the work within. The second part of the question, question 4, asks, has the organisation assessed future climate-related risks? So this is asking whether your organisation has completed a climate change risk assessment. Now, how you do this is explained in step 3 of our guidance, but it looks like this table here. So what this shows is an assessment of the climate risks that you're currently most vulnerable to on the left, and the bit in blue is the part that assesses the risks from future climate change, and this means assessing from the 2020s or 2030s onwards. The key to answering this question is to specifically refer to future climate-related risks. Even if you haven't done a risk assessment, if you say that you haven't assessed future climate-related risks, then that's a perfectly acceptable answer. If you don't distinguish between assessing your current risk and your future climate risk, then it looks like you don't understand the question. So this is an example of an organisation who have specifically referenced future climate-related risks. The other clue that they understand the question is in their reference of the UK climate projections, which provide projections of the future climate for the whole of the UK. You don't need to refer to this specifically, but for this example, it shows that they understand what's involved in undertaking an assessment of future climate change. This example says, the organisation considers future climate-related risks in a number of its development and planning processes, primarily through the use of the UK CP09 climate change scenarios to predict changes to various risks, to new developments and current infrastructure. What's good about this example is that it shows they've understood the question, but in terms of adaptation performance, the word considered could imply that they have not actually done a full assessment of future climate-related risks, and because there's no link to an assessment, we have to presume they haven't actually done one. So what this needs, in addition to this text, is to say we plan to undertake a comprehensive risk assessment to future climate-related risks in 2017, for example. Okay, so let's remind ourselves where we are in the adaptation process. We've talked about questions 2A, B, and C, and 4A, I, and II, and through that covered steps 1 to 3. Let's look at questions 4B and 4C, which is covered in step 4 of our guidance, and is about reporting and implementing your adaptation arrangements. So question 4B asks, what arrangements does the organisation have in place to manage climate-related risks? The term arrangements means any strategic plans, policies, or action plans that your university or college have to help them manage or adapt to climate change. So if your university or college doesn't have any plans in place that specifically cover adaptation, that's fine, just say exactly that. If they do, copy those lines out of the document and paste it into the online form. If you're signed up to the universities and colleges' climate commitment for Scotland, you may be able to reference that, but make sure there's a statement about adaptation that you can pull out from it. This is an example from a local authority on how they manage climate-related risks. It says the organisation's emergency and business continuity plans are wide enough in scope to apply to risks associated with disruption to energy, transport, water, and ICT, rising sea levels for coastal communities, impacts on health and well-being. Departmental risk registers include climate-related risks but are not referenced as such, and all council strategies, plans and programmes are assessed for their environmental impact, including climate change, adaptation, risk and opportunities. So what strikes me about this answer is that it's a very accurate representation of how climate change is considered within this organisation. For example, it says that their department's risk register includes climate-related risks but are not referenced as such. So I'm sure this is the case for many organisations, and the key is for those who have identified this to try and change that language so climate change is seen as a higher priority. But more generally, the key things that the reviewer will pick out for this answer are the documents that climate change sits within. So for this one, it's the emergency and business continuity plans and the risk registers. Sorry I don't have more university and college specific examples. This one's an NHS example. Hopefully I'll see some shining examples from you all this year so I can use them as examples for my presentations next year. This slide says that their Sustainable Development Action Plan contains actions and timescales specifically on climate change, adaptation and mitigation. Risks are recorded on their DATIX, the organisation's risk reporting tool. They have site business continuity plans, corporate disaster recovery plan, and a major incident plan, which details procedures that should be undertaken in the event of a major incident. So the only thing that they could do to improve this would be if for point 2 they stated if their climate risks were recorded on their risk reporting tool and which climate risks they had included here. The key thing is the 5 key documents, the Sustainable Development Action Plan, the Risk Reporting Tool, the Business Continuity Plans, the Disaster Recovery Plan, and the Major Incident Plan. Question 4C asks, what action has the organisation taken to adapt to climate change? So this question is looking for any adaptation actions that your university or college have implemented. And this could be widening your gutters to adapt to the impacts of heavy rainfall, or including adaptation on any staff training programs that you run. In the world of adaptation, we describe adaptation actions as those that build the adaptive capacity of an organisation, such as raising awareness of adaptation, and those that involve delivering adaptation actions, such as implementing a flood protection scheme. So you may be able to provide examples of one or the other, or both. Showing 3 or 4 examples with a mix of both would be good for this answer. So this is an exemplar answer. I don't expect to see as many examples from yourselves. There are many here, but it just divides the actions into building adaptive capacity on this slide and delivering adaptation actions, which I'll show on the next slide. So this organisation said that they were selected to be a participant in the Adaptation Learning Exchange. It's one of Adaptation Scotland's peer support programmes. In February, a Managing Risk and Building Resilience workshop was held for key service representatives to build understanding of adaptation. In 2015, face-to-face meetings took place with key service representatives to complete climate impact assessments. Work commenced in the development of a range of staff sustainability training measures, which includes adaptation, and they produced a briefing paper on climate adaptation for senior managers. These are the examples of delivering adaptation actions. So they completed a natural flood management project involved in the development of a climate change park with Green Space Scotland, made improvements to a green space network, done core path remediation to address flooding erosion, and are developing a surface water management plan. So in the 5 steps, these questions are covered in section 4, which talks about implementing your adaptation actions, compiling the evidence and work you've done through steps 1 to 3, and reporting on your adaptation work, whether internally to senior managers or externally through the public body's reporting process. Question 4D is one of the questions that doesn't align with the 5 steps as it refers to the SCAP. So this question asks you to explain what the organisation is doing to support the delivery of the policies and proposals contained within the SCAP. So this involves finding the SCAP online, going to the objective tables and looking under the Who Will Deliver column to find out if there is a specific policy or proposal that says universities or colleges. I've checked the SCAP. It seems that overall universities are only responsible for policy N12, and there are no policies for colleges to report against, but you won't get marked down for reporting or implementing if you want to. So for colleges, you can write not applicable for this answer. I think Scotland's Rural College and Harriet Watt are the exceptions here. They have a few more policies to implement, but policy N12 is the university reporting policy. It's about increasing the understanding of the implications of climate change for nature through data gathering, analysis and research. And it's the column on the right that shows that Scottish Government, Climate Exchange and universities are the ones that are responsible for implementing and reporting on this policy. Question 4E is looking for details of any arrangements that your university or college has in place to review the assessments of your current and future climate risks that you initially assessed. So this reviewing of your adaptation work is important to check whether the risks that you listed are still applicable and up to date with the latest information. And a second element to this question is to review plans and strategies that contain adaptation and when they're due to be updated and revised. So it's mainly looking for whether you review your adaptation work, what you were reviewing, and how often you review it. These are 2 separate examples for this question from last year. It says current and future climate risks will be reviewed when the climate change strategy is reviewed and updated during 2016. And this refers to reviewing current and future climate risks. Second says we are committed to producing an adaptation strategy by the end of 2015, and as part of this, it will be necessary to consider inclusion of review periods for assessing climate risks. The strategy will be an ideal place to present all this information in one place and provide a census to appropriate review periods. So the second example refers to reviewing their adaptation strategy. Hopefully through this, they will also review their current and future climate risks too. But you can see there how it's split into reviewing their current and future climate risks and reviewing their adaptation strategy. Question 4F is asking for details of whether your adaptation arrangements are being monitored and evaluated. Now, as important as monitoring and evaluation is, very few organisations are evaluating their adaptation work because most are still in the process of actually doing the adaptation work. So if you haven't done any work in this area, just state this in the text box and that's fine. This example explains that monitoring and evaluation work is planned for 2016, So we'll find out this year if they've actually done what they said they were going to do. So monitoring and evaluation of the impacts of adaptation actions will be assessed through the development of a climate change adaptation action plan for the city, and this work is planned for 2016. So these last two questions sit within step 5 of our 5 steps guidance, which is about establishing a process for monitoring and reviewing your adaptation work. So your process might be to review your adaptation work annually after you have submitted the public body's reports, or you might want to use an assessment tool such as the Climate Change Assessment Tool, the CCAT tool, at the start of your work, and then use it to measure progress against, use it as a baseline and use that annually to monitor your progress. The final question asks for your adaptation priorities for the coming year, and this may include work to build awareness on adaptation amongst your organisation, screening existing documents, plans and strategies for reference to climate risks, assessing your current climate risks, or implementing some of your adaptation actions. These are just a few examples that you might want to consider for your report: to embed adaptation in plans and strategies across departments and services, to run an adaptation awareness raising workshop, to include adaptation in staff training, to work with your local authority on adaptation work, or to work through the climate change assessment tool to gain a baseline score for your adaptation work. So those are just a few examples, and I'll take any questions now.
So if anybody has any questions, please could you post them in the chat box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen.
Okay, while those are coming through, I'll just pass over to Roddy Yard to continue the presentation. Roddy's the Assistant Director for Strathclyde University.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Hello, hope everybody can hear me.
Hello, we can hear you, Roddy.
Okay, good. Thanks, Sophie. I'm just going to talk you through a little bit about what we're doing at University of Strathclyde. If I can work out how to move the slides on. Rebecca, do you know how to move the slides on?
Yes, it's just above your screen, above the slides, there's an arrow facing right in the middle. Click the arrow facing right.
Ah, good, right. So climate change adaptation update and progress here at the University of Strathclyde. That image, I suppose, is trying to help place where we are in context a little bit. West of Scotland, it does rain occasionally, and sometimes quite violently with wind, as exemplified by this morning's monsoon conditions. If you're in Glasgow, you would have seen that. So to explain a little bit about the university here, we have 4 sites at the university, in and around the west of Scotland, around the Central Belt. Is the main John Anderson campus within Glasgow city centre, which covers 36 acres. Obviously a very urban centre of Glasgow location. Steep streets, as exemplified by the picture on the right. That's Montrose Street, if you know the centre of Glasgow at all. It's a 1 in 7 slope. I think the Commonwealth Games bike race climbed the col to Montrose Street as it went through the city a few years ago. We have a research centre near Cumbernauld called the Power Networks Demonstration Centre. That's in North Lanarkshire council area. So we have different councils to deal with and work alongside, all of whom are very supportive, I have to say. We have Advanced Forming Research Centre near the airport at Inchinnan. This is in Renfrewshire Council. These are a bit more rural, but still quite urban locations with appropriate drainage. AFRC is flat-lying in terms of flood risk. And then we have Ross Priory, which is near Loch Lomond in the national park, and that is right on the banks of the loch. 190 acres of rural estate, which definitely floods. So we do have flooding risk at some of our locations, and we have certainly got implications for runoff within the city, and we work quite closely with Glasgow City Council. So just moving on to the estate, purely for context, that you don't need to think about the detail of this, but you'll all have your own pictures of what your estate looks like, and you'll know which buildings would be at risk of flooding. You'll know what your development master plans are in terms of how the estate will change over time with new builds or refurbishments, demolition and so forth. And you'll all know what the outside influences are in terms of, for instance, public transport. And I think these things are important to start thinking about when you're talking about adaptation. People don't necessarily think about adaptation as being disruption to travel and how we might change how we get to and from the university. It's kind of dealt with under more a business continuity domain, and the language within that is probably talking about adaptation and mitigation, and that needs to be something you need to start thinking about how you might work on that. That's certainly something that we're starting to do. So in terms of estates within the university here, because I work within the estate services section, as I'm sure many will. In Glasgow specifically, there are big issues in terms of how Glasgow manages its surface water and the threats of climate change associated with that. The west of Scotland is rising in temperature. Milder winters, more intense rainfall. These are all aspects that the local authority is certainly dealing with. And because of where we are in the city centre, a lot of our rainfall falls away to the south of our site, and it ends up literally at the front door of the council chambers. And that really is literally, that's an impact that we have directly on the drainage system within Glasgow. So there is a focus on us as an institution on what we're doing to mitigate and also to adapt to climate change. So some of the issues and drivers for the university, these pictures try and give you an idea of some of the impacts that we have. Definitely we have severe weather events. They do have an impact on travel to and from the university for our students. We have 22,000 students, the vast proportion of which do travel on a daily basis to and from the university, and travel connections and infrastructure are important. The fabric of the estate is obviously of importance in terms of how the buildings cope with adaptation. We've got a range of buildings from 1900 right up to 2015, modern systems, modern design, and older systems with drainage that was maybe designed for a period where there wasn't such intense rainfall. And so these are issues for us. And we do have to think about how our building fabric and our natural environment and the kind of social space that we have in and around our university is able to cope with and adapt to more intense rainfall. So what does the student experience look like in terms of climate change adaptation, for instance? How do we manage that going forward? So we need to start planning to reduce these risks and identify if there are opportunities to create better awareness, but also in terms of where we are, we want to try and bring our students and our research teams together to start to look at adaptation in real terms, to see if there are opportunities for research, for teaching, to start to exemplify some of the infrastructure changes that we would be doing to adapt to climate change, and I'll cover those in a little bit more detail. The computer catches up. So that picture in the top left is at the bottom of Montrose Street. The building on the left is the council chamber. On a wet day, water teems down from the right of the picture and courses across that junction and heads down towards the Clyde. And the picture in the bottom right is to try and kind of give you a picture of the steepness of our estate. Rainfall does cascade from one part of the estate down to the other. So a lot of what I'm thinking of is how do we capture that rainfall runoff within the municipal drainage system? How do we intercept it, slow it down, attenuate, and minimise the rapid discharge into the drainage system that the council, Scottish Water and SEPA have to deal with? So I think it is important to think about local planning policy. Certainly within Glasgow City, there is a big focus on sustainability. There is a drive to improve the sustainability of the city. One of their biggest infrastructure drivers is drainage, and managing that is a large drain on the capital resources of the city. So I think we're aware of that, and we're trying to think how we can help to minimise impact on the city's infrastructure. Sustainable Glasgow is the partnership that we sit on, and we talk to the representatives of Sustainable Glasgow about how we can manage lots of sustainability issues, including change adaptation. So placemaking for Glasgow, it is a destination. It's a massive income generator. So just like the university, we're a generator of income, and we have to start thinking about how we work together to not negatively impact on that income generating potential, and making Glasgow fit for purpose, if you like, in this age of climate change adaptation. So just to get into a wee bit more detail about what we're doing, I participated in the adaptation workshop that Sophie organised along with colleagues, and I found it very useful, and that helped us to understand what climate change mitigation is and also what adaptation is. So what I'm doing with the colleagues is to get that kind of understanding spread across the university. And we are starting to think about what our vulnerability is for climate change and what risks sit within it. I've run a risk workshop where we've started to develop an understanding of what our key risks are and what our risks aren't. So the lower level risks, if you like, we can kind of manage to deal with. And we're starting to prioritise really what we think is important going forward, bearing in mind the reporting duties, bearing in mind infrastructure, budgets in terms of what we might be able to achieve in terms of capital spend. So we're developing an adaptation plan and a business case that sits around that. And a lot of what I'm doing there is about focusing on the infrastructure and working very much with partners. So I'm talking now to Scottish Water, I'm talking to the council, I'm talking to the other wider council areas, because we've not just got the city centre site to think about. I'm definitely thinking about and starting to implement some of this infrastructure thinking into our development master plan. So when we build new buildings and we refurbish new buildings, we are starting to think about how to properly embed our thinking with our design teams and business partners for new buildings, and also kind of using that as an opportunity to raise awareness. The third bullet point beneath that is about integrating. So where we are with this kind of steep site within the John Anderson campus, for instance, there is a real opportunity to create landscaping that doesn't just sort out an issue and helps us to adapt, but it also creates a focus for learning and teaching and for the student experience. So again, thinking about things like rain gardens and tying that back to the infrastructure developments that the City Council is starting to work on within the wider Glasgow area. We certainly want to mirror that within the estate and think about how we might be able to solve a problem, but also create an opportunity and a wider benefit for staff, for students, and for visitors who come to the university to see that there is a technological solution, a biodiversity solution, a social improvement, if you like, in terms of the infrastructure. So we create a bit more green space that has a function and isn't just a lot of concrete and hard standing. And starting to change that mindset is a challenge, I think, and it's something that we'll all face. The final point then, I think, is really just getting into the kind of statutory requirement to obviously populate the assessment tool, think about what this really means in terms of the reporting duties and what you want to put down within your form that you fill in annually. So that's a bit of kind of, we have to do this, so what we're going to do about it. This slide here is a piece of work that I'm working on with Scottish Water and academic colleagues to try and think about what a rain garden would look like in the very centre of our campus. And it's not very helpful in terms of what it looks like, but if you imagine these two lines running north-south, they are the path of travel of surface water in heavy rainfall. I want to intercept those and start to create a bit more attenuation between those two lines, so we slow the path of travel from north to south, from one part of the estate down the hill to the other. So that this is where the rain gardens solution comes in. I'm trying to think about what that might look like. And that's a visual kind of representation of what our steeply sloped area at the centre of the campus might look like in terms of in the future. So at the moment it's very much a steep twin carriageway road. We want to take control of that roadway and create a bit more of a student experience that also solves some of the adaptation issues, no traffic, pedestrianisation, biodiversity, Wi-Fi, all of these things built in, but beneath the ground we're actually doing something useful to attenuate and manage the runoff from that particular area. And these sorts of thinking, this sort of thinking is what I'm trying to apply to all of our estate across the board. So the next steps really are to, as I say, focus on our priorities and really start to work more productively, more formally, I suppose, with our local authorities and all the other stakeholders. Basically, we're up for doing this. We think it's important. We think there's an opportunity in this to create better space that actually functions well for the future and starts to engage in research and teaching. And so that all staff, students and visitors are a bit more aware when they come to the university and when they leave it. And I think that's me. Thank you. Any questions?
So if anybody's got any questions for Roddy, please post them in the chat box. I've got a couple that have come in for Sophie. So the first one is, can Sniffer provide a work example of what best practice reporting would look like?
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, we can. I guess this webinar and the SSN guidance that I showed you at the start of the presentation explains how you can complete these questions, and I've provided examples of how to do it and how not to do it. I guess the problem with providing a worked example is that there are a number of different sectors that will all need different examples because of their unique context. So the best we can do is to provide a generic worked example, and I can look into that, but it will just depend how useful that's going to be for everybody, bearing in mind that there's kind of the NHS, there's universities and colleges, local authorities, all down to organisations reporting on deaths for marriages. So it's a very wide range of reporting bodies, but we can definitely look into that.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question, who, if anyone, will assess the validity of the statements made in your reporting?
Well, SSN analysed all the reports last year and did many stages of validation before they were able to start the analysis on the reports. They also contracted Carbon Forecast and ASA, I believe, to support that data analysis. And then ourselves, Adaptation Scotland and Resource Efficient Scotland analysed specific sections of the reports. So there's many stages of the validation between those contractors, but I can't say what the process is going to be this year. That was what happened last year.
Great, thank you. And then the last question I've got so far, so if anybody else wants to write another question, please go ahead now. As local authorities have similar and overlapping challenges to the further and higher education sector in their area, should we not be doing joint adaptation plans?
That's a very good question. I'd definitely like to see more joined up working between universities and colleges and local authorities. I think that's a good use of resources, but obviously I know that it's difficult to kind of form those partnerships. But the local authorities should be considering the universities and colleges in their adaptation plans. But universities and colleges, just like local authorities, also need to consider their own, go through a process of assessing their critical infrastructure assets and services that they provide, and then looking to assess the vulnerability of those to current and future risks. So that's something that both universities and colleges and local authorities and other organisations all need to address. And the vulnerabilities will be different between local authorities and universities and colleges. So while it'd be good to have some form of joined up approach, there are going to be differences in risks and vulnerabilities that need to be brought out in separate adaptation plans.
Brilliant, thank you. And then we've had a couple more questions.
Okay.
So submissions can have a positive bias, for example, for PR purposes. So how do we know if there's an objective baseline or a real-world assessment of the information that's submitted?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question there.
I think basically, how do we get an objective assessment of the inputs to the reporting? Is there any way to objectively do an assessment of the sector?
As in, is there a baseline answer? Or are we looking for performance or?
Perhaps we'll leave that one, and I'll ask for the person that asked the question to clarify it. That would be great, and we'll move on to the next question for now.
On that question.
Okay. The next question was to Roddy. So, Roddy, how do we deal with the apathy? i.e., we're working on a year-to-year time frame at best, and longer term seems a long way off. There are too many reactive things to do. So, how do you deal with that within your institution?
Well, the way I'm dealing with it is ultimately getting infrastructure in the ground and integrated within projects. So making sure that design teams build in adaptation technology and solutions into any new builds where I can. And ultimately working, which I think is really important, working with the local authorities, referencing that earlier question about joined up thinking. So if we certainly put our hand up to the local authority, say, we want to work with you on this, so that we're being proactive with them rather than them saying to us, say when we do another planning application for a new building and we haven't thought about an adaptation solution, the planners may not be as amenable to granting approval, and we end up, going over budget because we've forgotten to integrate an adaptation solution into our plans, because that is a reality now. The planning guidance that is coming out and coming through local authorities will impact on universities and colleges, and if those solutions aren't integrated within the plans for a new building or a major refurbishment where planning permission is needed and where there is a climate change adaptation impact, you need to start thinking about this stuff now. So we can be apathetic, but it would be at risk in terms of project programme, it would be at risk in terms of project budget, in terms of relationships with the local authority. So for all those reasons, that's why I think we should be proactive and talk to our local authority purely just on the planning side, if for no other reason. I think that's a good way of going forward.
Brilliant, thanks Roddy. So to return to that previous question, basically how do we get a real world performance measure against some sort of nomical good practice, not just a desktop assessment?
Okay, I think when we actually analysed the adaptation section of the reports last year, and we were contracted to just look at the how well people had understood the question, how well the questions had been answered. So we also did our own analysis on how well organisations are progressing with adaptation. So we were able to have a performance evaluation and a functional evaluation of the reports. And so it was quite clear there's two distinct analyses, that one that showed those that had understood the question and weren't progressing with adaptation very well, or those that hadn't understood the question and weren't progressing with adaptation well. And I think that those two were quite clear, and we had, in our own analysis, organisations that had scored very highly on the reporting process and had understood the question very well, but it was clear that they hadn't progressed with adaptation. And I think that's obvious for our point of view, and I can't comment on Resource Efficient Scotland when they're looking at the reports, but it's why we're asking for links to your assessments or pulling out key statements. It's very obvious to the experts in the field to know whether it's just a nicely written statement, i.e. a good PR, as you put it, or if it's if work is actually being done and adaptation is being progressed well. And so I think that's, I hope it's not just down to good PR, but most of the time those that are progressing with adaptation, we are in close contact with as well. So we're aware of the work that's being done out there. I hope that answers the question.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Sophie, very much.
Okay.
So, thank you to both Sophie and Roddy for your input today, and also to you all for tuning in and asking questions. I will email you all a link to the podcast of this webinar tomorrow, so you can refer to it at a later date and also share it with any relevant colleagues. We've been asked by the Sustainable Scotland Network to mention that all universities and colleges should now have received their login details to access the online reporting platform to complete the Public Bodies Climate Change Duties Report template. If you have not received these, please contact the SSN team on ssn@keepscotlandbeautiful.org and they will arrange access for you. The third webinar in this Adaptation Webinar Series will be the same time next Wednesday, the 27th of July, led by Penelope Pickering, a sustainability consultant at ACOM, looking at how tertiary education organisations can integrate their findings from climate change risk assessments and adaptation assessments into normal business activities. You can sign up to this session on the EAUC website now, or if you're unavailable, you can find a link to request to receive a podcast of the webinar. Please remember to complete the feedback survey when you receive it. Thank you very much to you all for joining us.